Oh, there it goes. As folks can see, I am recording this session. It'll be posted to our resource library for folks to either refer back to or share out, hopefully tomorrow, but if not very early next week, it will be there. We would now like to give folks a chance either to come off mute or in the chat to put who they are. So your name, organization, role, pronouns, land. I did put a link in the chat to find out whose lands you're on. And also we would like to know if folks have worked within faith-based communities before, or if you're interested in starting that work. And I guess as I'm waiting for folks to raise hands or put things in the chat, I realized I didn't really answer that question for myself. I am Jewish and I have done faith-based community work in the sense of I'm very involved in my own synagogue. And I remember growing up and seeing posters in the restrooms about, if you feel unsafe, here's the number that you call. But that was about the extent of just, me being as a personal congregant and my experiences there. And then obviously, as you all know, because I mentioned I'm a prevention specialist and I've met some of you previously. I have been doing this work for a little over 10 years now, but haven't had as much of a chance to marry the two as I would like to. So I'm very excited for the opportunity today to have both Saphira and Saara here with us. Do folks mind sharing? If not, maybe we can do a hand raise. If folks can see the hand raise icon on their screen, at the bottom, you can raise your hand. How about if you've worked within faith-based communities before?
I'll share.
Okay.
My name is Vanessa, she, her pronouns. I'm a group facilitator for Interfaith Children and Family Services. I'm on Shumash land. I shared that in the chat. But currently, I am facilitating parenting, so Triple P, positive parenting group, along with A Windows Between Worlds, which is like an art alternative to like art therapy at a it's a faith-based, it's Christian-based. It's kind of like a transitional home for women that are women and families that are becoming self-sufficient again. It's kind of like they've gone through the rehab process, and so now they're in this shelter to secure housing, and I bring those services there to them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I am seeing some folks sharing in the chat. I see we have another Shalom Bite employee here. We have Callan says that they were raised in the church. We have Dree says they have not worked yet with faith-based, but looking forward to it. Kayla is also new to faith-based prevention. So really excited that maybe a lot of folks get some opportunities to learn throughout this presentation. With that, I would like to pass it to Saphira if you want to get us started with your section.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to participate. I'm really happy to be here. Also really appreciate all of you for joining us in this important conversation. So as I mentioned, I have been doing this work at Shalom Bayit since 2005. So I joined the team in February of 2005. Shalom Bayit, the organization, has been around since 1992. So March 8th is our anniversary. We'll be celebrating our 31st anniversary this year. And I just want to tell you a little bit about why Shalom Bayit exists. So why did an organization like Shalom Bayit start so many years ago? And then I'm going to give you some very specific examples of how Shalom Bayit does prevention with a faith-based lens. And as much as I can, there's going to be a few moments where I'm going to try to be interactive and asking you all questions, and hopefully you will participate. So shalom bayit, those are Hebrew words. The word shalom means hello, goodbye, and peace. In this context, peace. And the word bayit means house or home. So the organization in English means peace in the home. Peace in the home, shalom bayit, is actually a Jewish value. And one of the issues, and historically with this Jewish value, it was actually used to further, in some ways, sort of abuse and victimize survivors. So what I mean by that is when women were being abused in their homes, I don't know if you know this, I don't know the exact statistic, but overwhelmingly, I think it's about 70% of people, when they are in crisis, whatever kind of crisis they're in, they first turn to their clergy, whoever that person is, or their spiritual leader. So as we know, those of us who are doing domestic violence work, we know that the very first person that a survivor talks to, that person's response is really essential and will influence the rest of that survivor's healing journey. So what was happening historically in the Jewish community, and unfortunately still happens, if women were coming forward to tell their rabbi, which is the Jewish spiritual leader, I'm being abused. And their rabbi would say, as the woman, it is your responsibility to make shalom bayit, to make peace in your home. So you need to go home and make peace in your home. And you can see how for someone who's being abused, there is a pattern of power and control, being told that they're the one that's responsible, they have to go home and make shalom bayit. You can imagine that that woman was then not calling one of our organizations to get support afterwards, because this person that they trust, that she trusts and feels like is her leader, is actually telling her she's responsible. So in 1992, Naomi Tucker, who is one of the co-founders and still the executive director of Shalom Bayit, was asked to serve on a national panel about domestic violence in the Jewish community. And at the time was working in local shelters here in the Bay Area, and recognized that while it seemed the research was showing that Jewish women were experiencing abuse at the same rate as all other people, Jewish women were not coming into shelters and were not calling into the domestic violence programs. So why was that? So Naomi got around literally a kitchen table with a group of people who were doing domestic violence work who happened to be Jewish to talk about this issue. And this is how Shalom Bayit was born. We realized that if we really wanted to make sure that Jewish survivors would feel safe to come forward, we needed to approach the issue from the Jewish perspective. And one of the ways Shalom Bayit did that first was by reclaiming this Jewish value of Shalom Bayit and talking about what does it really mean to have Shalom Bayit? What does it really mean to have peace in the home? And we as a community are all part of that picture, that it's a communal responsibility to make sure that everyone in our community has peace in the home. So in the beginning, I just want to share, this is one of my favorite examples of how our work has changed in this 31 years, is when we first started doing our work, we were an all volunteer collective, and we contacted our local synagogues and we wanted to host a support group. And we said, can we host a group in your synagogue? And the response was literally people closing the door and saying, this issue does not happen here. This issue does not happen to people like us. And I put that in quotes. Now, here we are, 31 years later, we have over 90 rabbis from the 9 counties of the Bay Area who serve on our Rabbinic Advisory Council. They are actually listed on our website. They are listed on our letterhead to show their support. And so a big part of the work that Shalom Bayit does, both with intervention and prevention, is educating rabbis, educating clergy. And we also do interfaith clergy trainings. So Shalom Bayit decided to reclaim this term to really address the fact that there's this myth of peace in the Jewish home, and that Jewish people, like anyone, unfortunately, there can be violent or can be abusive. So that's why we're here. That's why Shalom Bayit exists. Now I want to share with you, I'm going to actually bring a little bit of a teaching that I love, that I use in all of my work with youth. So one of the things that Shalom Bayit does is we have a prevention program called Love Shouldn't Hurt. And our Love Shouldn't Hurt program was started in 2002, actually by a college student. And we now reach usually over about 1,400 youth and parents and educators every year, teaching about healthy relationships, healthy boundaries, consent, what is dating and domestic violence, and how to prevent it. And we do all of that through a Jewish lens. So one of the ways that we do that is we bring in Jewish text and Jewish teaching into our curriculum. So I'm going to give you an example of one of my favorite Jewish teachings that I use. And I also use this when I do interfaith work, or even work with organizations that are not faith-based. So one of my favorite texts in Jewish teachings is, there was someone named Rabbi Hillel who lived thousands of years ago. He's kind of like a famous Jewish guy. There's buildings named after him. There's a college, there's an organization. So he was kind of a big deal in the Jewish community. He said a lot of things, but this is my most favorite. He said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? So this is where I want to involve you. I want to ask you, when you read this, what jumped out at you? What does this mean to you? And the question I want to specifically ask is, how is this quote related to the topic of healthy relationships or the topic of preventing abusive relationships? So I'm going to give you a moment to just sit with that question. And then I would like to encourage anyone who's brave to come off mute and answer, or feel free to put some thoughts in the chat. But I would love to hear from folks. And this is an activity that I do with people as young as, 11 years old, all the way through, I was going to say 100, but I don't know that I've actually ever worked with anybody 100, but I did a workshop once for my group. Actually, my family requested that I do a workshop on healthy boundaries, which I just want to tell you is pretty hilarious, because I had come from a family where boundaries doesn't exist. So I was amazed that my great aunt was asking me, who is one of the worst when it comes to modeling boundaries. But in that workshop was my 90-year-old grandma. So I think 90 was the oldest participant I've asked this question to. So thank you for putting the questions in the chat. So how is this quote related to prevention? What does it mean to you? Does anyone want to share out loud or come on or put it into the chat?
I'll share.
Thank you so much, Vanessa.
So reading that quote, it makes me think of, if someone doesn't advocate for me, who will? So if you're in an abusive relationship, and you don't stick up for yourself, and sticking up for yourself can look however way looks best for you. But like for me, if I were in something like that and I knew it wasn't for me and that it wasn't benefiting me, that, sticking up for myself would probably be leaving. And if I don't leave, then when will it stop? And if I don't act now, what will happen, or who will become of me, or what will become of me? So yeah, that's what that quote says to me when I read it.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. One of the values within Judaism is to question, and to that every one of us has all of our opinions and all of our thoughts are valid. There's no right or wrong answer. So when I do an activity like this with youth, we always emphasize this is not math. This is not 2 + 2 = 4. So all of our answers are the right answer. One of the questions or the thoughts that often comes from this quote is a question that I pose. So I'm going to pose this question for all of you too, which is, who is the one person in our lives that we're all guaranteed to be in a relationship with from the moment we're born till the day we die? Does anyone want to unmute and say, or put it in the chat? Who is the one person we're all guaranteed to be in a relationship with from the moment we're born to the day we die? Ourself. That is the only guaranteed lifelong relationship that we have. And when was the moment in your life that you thought of yourself as a relationship? That's not a question you have to answer out loud, but something I want you to consider. At what point in your life did you even think about yourself as a relationship? This is something that I think is really important to talk to young people about, because we talk about relationships as something we have to put effort and energy toward. So if we think about ourselves as a relationship, of course, then we have to put effort and energy into the relationship we have with ourselves. So I think this Rabbi Hillel quote speaks to that, because one of the questions I'll ask youth is, do you think there's a significance to the order of the statements? So the first statement, and I'll just put it in the chat again so it's like here recent for you to see, is, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? So sometimes what people think of when they see this quote is they think of the oxygen mask instructions on an airplane. And I just want to tell you, when I ask youth, what are the instructions on the airplane? It all too often, they'll tell me, you put on other people's masks before your own. So there's two problems with that answer. One is it means they're not listening to the instructions. But the second issue is actually, to me, it speaks to our culture. And very often that response is coming from girls. And while I myself don't exist on the gender binary, we are socialized in this culture as if there are only two genders. And whether you agree with this message or not, people who are socialized as girls are often socialized to put other people's needs and wants before their own. So I love getting young people to think about this idea of the oxygen mask and how that can relate to relationships. What does it mean to put on our own mask first before putting on other people's? I also do workshops for parents, and I bring this text. And one of the things that I tell parents is I like to imagine there are 3 different kids on the airplane. And I want us to imagine, who do we want our kid to be? So the first kid is the kid who the oxygen mask drops and they put on their own mask, and then they, life is good. I'm feeling good. This is great. They're just like, close their eyes, they've checked out. They're just, okay. So that's the person that usually we call selfish. Then the second text is, the second kid is, puts everybody else's mask on first, and then they pass out. Okay, I don't think we want our kid to be that one either. So then the third is, I think, the kid that hopefully we are as people too, and for any of us who have kids, want our kids to be, which is the one who, the minute the mask drops, we put on our mask, take a deep breath. Whew, okay, I'm breathing. Now I look around, who needs my help? I'm in community. So this is an example of how I bring a Jewish text and relate it to day-to-day life, both at thinking about relationships, personal relationships, and also community relationships. And I also use this as an opportunity to talk about different kinds of selfish. So I believe that there's 2 kinds of selfish. When we use that word selfish, we're actually talking about 2 different things. There's the kind of selfish that we are like, ugh. And that's when somebody else puts their wants above other people's needs. That's the selfish that we're like, so that's the person who puts on their mask and then just checks out. But what we actually want to see and celebrate is somebody putting their needs before other people's wants. And that is not selfish, although it's a form of selfish, it's actually self-care, and it's essential and necessary. So how are we teaching that to the young people in our lives, to think about the importance of putting on our own mask first? So that's an example of how I use Jewish texts to spark a conversation about healthy relationships with self and with others. I'm going to give just a couple, in my last little time with you, I want to give you a couple other examples of how Shalom Bayit uses faith to think about prevention. And then even though focusing today on prevention, I just want to give a couple quick examples of how we do it in our intervention as well. So one I want to share is there's an activity that many of us probably have done. That's an activity where we do looking at stereotypes along gender lines. And again, acknowledging that there are not just 2 genders, but we are socialized in this culture as if there are only 2. So we do an activity called an act like a man, act like a woman box. Have you ever done this, where you draw a erase board and you write the word man, and then you have people brainstorm what are adjectives and words we think of when we think of what it means to act like a man. And then we do the same thing for act like a woman. And what's really interesting, so I'm going to give just some examples of, so for the act like a man, you'll often get like strong, assertive, aggressive, loud. And then for women, you'll get like passive, quiet, emotional. Those are some examples. Now, what's really interesting from a faith-based perspective is that if you do this brainstorm with a group of Jewish adults, your boxes will look almost exactly the opposite as the act like a man, act like a woman box. What I mean is the stereotypes of a Jewish man are usually gentle, quiet, educated, caring. And then for the woman, the Jewish woman, you have loud, in control, head of the family, runs the show, aggressive. So it's very interesting how a lot of the stereotypes that exist in our Jewish community counter these stereotypes, which can create this myth of peace in the Jewish home. Because if you imagine growing up hearing myths that Jewish men are all gentle and kind and caring and educated, and Jewish women are loud and assertive and run the show, then if you are in an abusive relationship that's heterosexual, that adds additional layers to this disbelief or this self-blame that can happen. And that's happening to survivors of all religions, ethnicities, sexual orientations. There's already this shame that's happening, but there's additional layers that can happen in communities like the Jewish community and other communities where there are these harmful stereotypes that, so then you grow up hearing this doesn't happen to, quote, people like me. And then if it's happening to you, you wonder, what is wrong with me? There must be something really terribly wrong with me because this isn't happening to people like me. I'm so strong. I'm assertive. I shouldn't. And I had someone say to me, don't should yourself. So I just love that saying. I just want to share with you. Don't should yourself. But those are the messages we often hear. So one of the other ways that Shalom Bayit does faith-based work is by working with and engaging other faith communities to think about how can you all do this work in your community. So I saw in the introductions, a lot of you have come from backgrounds of like church and other faith communities. So one of the things that Shalom Bayit as a resource for people that I just want you all to know is to help adapt our materials to work with other faith communities. So for example, we have a published curriculum, the Love Shouldn't Hurt curriculum for middle school, high school, college, and parents, and all through a Jewish lens. And one of the things that we've done is worked with other faith communities to figure out how can they do this same kind of prevention education within other communities. So I worked with the Archdiocese in San Francisco to adapt our curriculum to work with the Catholic community, because a lot of the teachings also that we're using are from the Torah, which is for many folks the Old Testament, and teachings within the Christian faith as well. One of the pieces of our work that also is really important is the spiritual healing that we do with survivors. So we do that both in our individual counseling as well as in our support groups. And I'm just sharing that too, because I think it's important for other domestic violence organizations to know if this is a resource, because we do not only serve Jewish survivors, we serve anyone and everyone who needs our support. And we do have many survivors who join our support group who are not Jewish, who are just really interested in the faith-based element of our work and thinking about how can we use our spirituality to help and support and inform healing. There's also a lot of really incredible teachings in the Torah and the Old Testament that can be linked to thinking about oppression and domestic violence. So an example for anyone who's familiar with the story of the Exodus, this is when the Jews were enslaved in Egypt and they finally were able to flee, and they arrived at the Dead Sea. And there's a really powerful moment in that story because they've now left their abusive situation, but many of them then regretted that choice and said, we want to go back, because that's really scary and we don't know what's on the other side. And we know what's back there, even though that was slavery, we knew what it was like and we knew how to survive that. But out there in that desert, what's there, we don't know. So that's a really interesting metaphor to think about with survivors, about or people who are not survivors, actually, to get them to think about what it might be like to think about the barriers to leaving an abusive relationship. And so often, right, we hear people say like, oh, well, why don't they just leave? And to think about how leaving for many people might not feel like an option at all, and it might not be a safe option. To think about how our teachings and our stories kind of speak to that. Another just little example I want to give about how important it is to do faith-based work is when you are in crisis, that is a moment where actually holding on to our culture and our traditions is paramount. Because when the rest of your world is being thrown into disarray, holding on to traditions and what you know is sometimes more important than ever. And so there are many Jewish families who keep kosher, which means that they eat in a very specific way. And I say many because definitely not all Jewish people keep kosher, but many do. And just a quick example, we had a client once who fled from another state with her 8 children to leave her abusive partner. And when she arrived here in the Bay Area, she needed shelter. There is no such thing as a kosher shelter in the Bay Area. So there is no such thing as a shelter that has a kosher kitchen or serves kosher food. So one of the ways that Shalom Bayit was able to support this survivor and her 8 children was to organize the local Jewish community, people who keep kosher in their homes, to cook meals for this survivor and her family. And then we were able to get the meals delivered to her and her family in shelter. So that during this time when all these kids, when their lives had been turned upside down and they were in a new state, where they were able to hold on to some of these traditions that are so near and dear to them. So those are some examples of how we think about how our faith can be a part of both prevention and healing in the aftermath of abuse. I have lots of other ways that I bring faith into my work, and I'd love to share that with you all at some point if you're interested. So I did, I think I put into the chat, the website, yes. So I put in the chat the Shalom Bayit website. Please feel free to check out our website, and my email is listed on there. If you are interested in thinking about interfaith work, we do a lot of interfaith work, so I would love to talk with you about that. Really, any ways that Shalom Bayit can support you in doing this work with your faith community, we're excited to talk with you and partner with you. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And I know that after we hear from Saara, we're going to also have a chance for questions. So thank you very much.
I am on mute. Really, you think at this point I would know to unmute myself. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I know there's so much more that you could add, but thank you for giving all of us kind of a primer on this. I am now going to turn it over, as we said, to Saara to share about her work.
Thanks, Zafira. So I'm excited. When we met to coordinate, there was we were talking about the possibility of crossover, but I also think that there's the benefit of that, because I think that sharing crossover experiences across different faith backgrounds and different backgrounds just shows you that there's some strong commonalities in this work, and then we can build on that. I think when we see common threads and similarities, I think it's easier to figure out, target the zone in on which areas need attention. So I think that'll be beneficial. Also, the Muslim community I come from also does a lot of interfaith conversations as well. And I always think those are great, because same thing, I think you will hear different people come with completely different sets of stories or, text or, things, but then ultimately there's, again, so much commonality and similarity I think you'll find across the concepts. And I think one of the most powerful things about working in faith-based communities is that it's so values-based. And those interfaith dialogues and conversations, I always walk away recognizing that even though there's so many differences across race or background or language or culture, the values in faith communities are often pretty similar and common. So I'm taking a little different approach where I'm going to just share two of my own experiences kind of intersecting with faith-based community. And so I'll give two examples. One is community that's not my own, and kind of share that experience. And then the second one is my own Muslim community that I grew up in. And I won't name it just because I am not speaking on behalf as a representative of my community. So just to know that, you know, I'm coming from a minority sect of Islam, and, you know, there's over 70 different sects of Islam, and even when we're speaking on behalf of something, that there's a lot of diversity and range in that. And I think that's important to mention. I'll try to make sure I'm speaking slow. I know I can get caught up and speak fast. So the two examples I wanted to share, or experiences I wanted to share, are the first one was my entrance into domestic violence work, which was in the South Asian community. So I grew up in an area in South King County. I don't know if folks are familiar with Washington, but I grew up in South King County. And there was a lot of South Asian community there, specifically mostly by Punjabi background, and a lot of predominantly Sikh community in that region. And there was a South Asian specific domestic violence organization that had been doing a lot of outreach since the community was growing a lot. And they also knew that there was incidents of domestic violence. And again, this is a crossover similarity to what Zafira was sharing, I think, where the organization knew that there was incidents of domestic violence occurring, but there was a gap in the number of women that were actually reaching out for their services. And so what they wanted to do was a community assessment to kind of really get to know the community more, and get over that stigma that they think they experience as a domestic violence organization. There's a lot of misconstrued like perception of what that means. And so they wanted to figure out why. And so we did it was about a 1-year community assessment project. And there was a number of us volunteers that were working on it. And we did a bunch of interviews with key leaders in the community. So we asked a lot of community members, like, who are the folks that are really the ones that are prominent figures? Who are the people that everyone really listens to or respects, etc. And I mean, unsurprisingly, a lot of them were faith-based leaders that were, leading the different South Asian communities. So folks from the Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu communities. So we had a pretty lengthy interviews with some of these leaders. And one of the similarities that we heard across from the religious leaders was that they were definitely getting sought out for domestic violence support. So women and anyone that was experiencing domestic violence was reaching out to their faith-based leaders for support. And after the long interviews and after the conversations, they kind of really came to admit and share and tell us that, they oftentimes felt really overwhelmed or lost. They weren't sure. And sorry if I'm not looking there. I have my notes and then you all on different screens. So sorry if I'm looking in different areas, but I'm here. So, they admitted to us that they could use more support in that area. So for us, again, we were members of the community. The volunteer group was all folks who either were from that region, were members of those different faith communities, some of the group was former survivors who had turned into volunteers and supporters of the organization. And then let's see. And then after that year-long assessment, it was really amazing to have had these religious leaders open up to us about their needs, but then also in an open forum space, have them share openly with others a little bit. We didn't disclose, who said what to who. We just disclosed the information that was shared in the summary format, in the open forum. We invited all the folks we interviewed. We invited folks from the community, and we gave them a report back on like the key elements that were shared with us. And when we shared that, it was really amazing to see dialogue and conversation from the community on how they saw the faith-based community's role in supporting. And there was a lot of differing opinions on that, right? You had some of the faith-based leaders were really kind of adamant that it wasn't a place for that. And some were like, yes, this makes sense, but we don't know how, right? And so it was really great to see the community actually have that conversation amongst themselves. And so I think opening up spaces like that and opening up the conversations, and I think really giving some like honor and respect to leaders in the community to share their perspective. I think that was really amazing to see them open up to us and share that. So the second half of that so after we finished the assessment, what we took from that was we wanted to create a safe space for the women, because one of the other things that we heard reoccurringly was, again, with this gap, was that women felt kind of unsafe to come to any of the events, or, there was a lot of, they're predominantly housewives. How can they kind of, we tried to figure out basically a way to get them to attend and get to know the organization and the services that were available. And so the second year we did a series, and I love workshop series. I think they're amazing. I think when you can figure out topics that are of interest to the community. I know Zafir, I think, was sharing, or one of you all was sharing about PPP. I know that the positive parenting program is great, and they provide a lot of language accessible materials as well. I think when you can provide topics and areas of interest to different groups and communities, that is a great entrance. So figuring out what those are and then providing that. So the series that we did, we basically focused on improving the body and wellness. So there was about 4 or 5 different events. The first one was about mind, which was a therapy and mental health awareness workshop. The second one was hands, which was a life skills workshop. And I can't remember, one of them was definitely a reproductive educational support workshop. And so after all of the presentations and trainings, we had information that was shared about the domestic violence organization. So we kind of slipped it in there, which can seem, I think, a little bit like, we're definitely not trying to hide anything, but I think it was a way, again, you open the dialogue with, you kind of, it's, like the cliche line, but I so believe in, you have to like meet communities where they are, kind of thing. And that was it. That's an example of how we did that, right? We were like, okay, we know that we can't, come at you with this, okay, here's domestic violence, it's an issue, because that was really difficult for the folks to hear, even though they were aware to some degree, etc. And again, this experience was with a wide range of South Asian women. So there was a lot of diversity among different faiths and different backgrounds. But again, what was powerful to see was the women themselves crossing, like coming to shared understanding even with each other. And that made it easier, I think, to see the issues at hand and the concepts at hand, which ultimately, you're doing basic kind of DV 101 conversations of explaining what power and control looks like, what the infringement of your autonomy and rights can look like. And when you can provide that information in an accessible way, I think it goes a long way. So those are the two. And then the last one that I wanted to share, the last experience of mine I wanted to share, was a series of workshops I did in my own Muslim community. So the 3 topics that we did for those workshops were DV 101, which was a basic, we went over the power and control wheel. We utilized a lot of, and I'll drop this link in the chat. We used a lot of resources from this organization called Peaceful Families. And I'll just put this in the chat. Peaceful Families provides a lot of Muslim community specific resources for domestic violence services and prevention work. And they do pretty great work. So we did a DV 101, and then the second conversation that we had was around women's rights. And this one felt important because we separated out, we had the community folks do an exercise where we separated out human rights from cultural beliefs. Here, let me just actually also. We had the folks, so basically the exercise was to go over specifically women, because we were working at that, the DV 101 was both with men and women, and then the second one, the women's rights presentation workshop, was focused just with women. And we went over different roles of women and how the women saw them from the Islamic perspective and how they saw them from a cultural perspective. And in doing so, it was really powerful because we could kind of separate out some of the Islamic values, which are much more related to equality and fairness, especially in Islam. There's a lot of teachings that actually, and this is a misunderstood concept, especially in Islam, even for women. Like, again, women themselves can be upholders of patriarchal norms, and you see that in a lot of communities. And so this misconceptions around the Islamic teachings and the cultural norms of patriarchy, and kind of helping folks to separate that out, was a really powerful exercise, because then you're actually encouraging folks to look at the text themselves, look at the teaching themselves, and understand it, come to that understanding on the teachings for themselves. Let's see. Sorry, I'm feeling like I'm spewing everything fast because I'm trying to get through everything. So let me know if I should slow down. Hopefully, everything is resonating. Feel free to drop questions or comments in the chat. Let's see. And then the last workshop that we did, this again for my own Muslim community, the last one we put together was a healthy relationships skill building workshop, where we focused on improving communications. After the first two workshops, so the DV 101 and the women's rights one, and this happens a lot, I think, especially when if you're working in any kind of community that's predominantly immigrant, and then you're working specifically with the women, I think you'll see this often where there's when the comfort level is established with who you're working with, I think you'll see a lot of times that they'll start coming to you with questions and wanting more support in different areas. And one of the ones we see all the time is definitely working with children, the parenting, the children, especially for immigrant communities where there's a lot of challenges around intergenerational and cultural experiences that are difficult for their parents to navigate. So that was definitely one of the ones we heard. So we put together an communications workshop, and it was great. We did active listening. I'm actually looking at the present. Actually, might share my screen real quick. Let me, just to give everyone a sense. Sometimes I'm a visual learner too, so hopefully this is helpful for folks. 222. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, awesome. Thank you. So basically this was the last workshop that we did. And so we opened it up with just a reminder, because I think, again, you want to give people the information so that they know why they're there. They know why they're listening to you. They know why they should be invested in listening to you. So we let them know that we had done the DV 101. We did the what are women's rights. And so now we were talking about healthy relationships. And so again, giving them the information of like, reassuring them that we're not teaching them anything that's against their Islamic values, right? We're doing this on the mosque. We're doing this in their space. We're doing this with them. We want to make sure. So reiterating that Islam gives them the information and the values already, but like, how are they actually practicing them? How are we seeing them show up in the communities? How are you actually practicing them? And then using the actual like Islamic text. So the whole activity for this one was definitely focused on active listening. And so bringing in some of that text and description to help reiterate why this is important, right? Why being able to actively listen to our family members and each other is important. And so bringing in some like Islamic text and background. And then let's see, we keep it, again, I think one of the other things is to keep it simple, right? So, and if you're using jargony words, you need to explain those jargony words to the community members and again, explain why those are important. So for this one, we can't just throw around intergenerational and intercultural. We wanted to really give folks understanding of what that means. Setting ground rules. Let's see. So we did the activity. Let's see, what else is there I might want to share. We did the communications activity, and again, bringing in teachings from the faith-based background to help support that value understanding. This one was on forgiveness. I think that's it. I'll stop sharing. I hope that was helpful. I'm a visual learner. So I guess the last thing I'll end with is just a recap of some of the challenges and then some of the benefits I experienced in all of these examples. So for the challenges, so there can definitely be, when I was doing the South Asian community assessment project, there can be definite challenges and discomforts in working with communities that are not your own, right? So in that example, I was interviewing leaders in communities that were not like, I'm Muslim, I'm not from the Sikh community, I'm not from the Hindu community. So like interviewing folks from different communities can, at first, might have felt a little bit unfamiliar and scary, I guess. But I think one of the benefits of that actually though is that sometimes it can be easier for folks to share and communicate with someone who's not from their community. Sometimes there's a lot of advantages from that in terms of like actually being able to hear from and learn from and establish some understanding. And we see this a lot in domestic violence service work as well. Sometimes, when you have very interconnected community, it can be hard to share and disclose experiences of violence. So sometimes it's actually beneficial for folks that are not from those communities and not from those backgrounds to be the ones that are opening that conversation and dialogue actually. So I hope that folks take that away from this conversation and be brave a little bit, because sometimes it can really help other communities to establish support from outside of their own community. And I think one of the other biggest things with that is do your own research when you're working. Okay, I'll wrap it up, Kimmy. Thanks. The one thing is to do your own research as well. I hate that I kind of have to say this, but I've also experienced this a lot of times, where when you are a person from a different faith or a background and you get tokenized when it is certain things like someone seeking services from your similar background, you know. And so I think I want to encourage folks to, even in culturally specific organizations where you have diversity and you have access, it can be sometimes a common thing to have someone from that background end up supporting that one person, but it doesn't always have to be, right? It's collective work. And I think that's an important reminder, not to just rely on that one contact you have with the community or that one connection, and kind of do your own research, like build a network, get to know some more other people, and know that you'll make mistakes, and that's okay, right? Like giving yourself some grace and gentleness with that. The second challenge is, like, you might be coming with different ideas and concepts that you feel are different and new for that community. Again, it might not be, right? But I think you have to do your own research to figure out how that community might see those concepts. And then also keeping it simple. I think that's a huge one. Again, keeping it really simple and language accessible, not just different languages, but also language in terms of the types of words and jargony words you're using, especially if you're working with demographics that have a broad range of age, generation, education levels, class levels, et cetera. You want to keep it simple and understandable for the whole group that you're working with. Patriarchy. Talked about this a little bit already, but it's definitely a big challenge in working with faith-based communities. And so figuring out how you can work around that, and can you work directly with the women? Again, keeping in mind that women are often also upholding those patriarchal norms. How can you have conversations that are more rights focused, right? Again, like that differentiation between the culture and the faith and rights-based focus, and trying to stick to the rights-based focus, because there's legal protections there, right? There's other protections there. Pushback. Well, you're going to face pushback, but none of us are in this field that don't already know that we're going to face pushback. And I think one of the ways to do prevention is I've experienced is, again, putting that positive spin on it. So when we did that health and wellness series, a lot of people were interested, right? They want to be healthy, they want to be well. Again, with the we called it, the series I did in my Muslim community, we didn't call it the domestic violence series. We called it the domestic harmony series, right? Because everyone wants to create harmony and healthy relationships, or at least I hope they do. It's much more accessible than here's a problem, here's violence, here's this messy, bad thing, and we want to talk about it. It's much more easier to get buy-in with that. And then the benefits are, again, I feel like faith-based communities have such a potential for being such a strong prevention change makers. Again, I think there's already a set of really strong values in a lot of faith-based communities. So how can you use those values to create safer, equitable, protected communities for all of us? And I think there's a lot of potential there. So I just spewed everything and tried to squeeze everything in my last 5 minutes. But I'm looking forward to the conversation part of this, because I don't do well spewing information at folks, but hopefully that was understandable, and I'm definitely down to answer questions and chat more about it. And
That
thanks
was
for
fantastic.
giving me grace.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Saara. So now, folks, we have about 30 minutes left. We're going to do probably the last 10 minutes on some announcements, but we have 20 minutes now for some Q&A. And I would love if folks who are attending today had questions for either Saara or Safira, or if you want to share if something resonated with you, Any thoughts from today's presentation? We would love to have that. You can either unmute, raise your hand, or put in the chat.
My name is Anne Nyarangi. I am new. I just learned about this meeting and the resources through the court system. They sent me resources, and then I ended up, that's how I ended up being aware about this meeting and coming to this meeting. And I am right now in the heat and in the middle of coming out of an abusive relationship with court legal issues involved. But I want to say what both the two speakers have spoken about, how like the first person, people I called who I trusted my faith leaders. Some didn't do anything for a long time. Some told me just persevere. Others told me God hates divorce. God hates you leaving your family. I remember one woman calling me and telling me, go back. When I left immediately, she told me, go back, it's bad. God hates people separating no matter how much you're abused. And she told me, I asked her, did you want me to die? But she told me, go back, your crown is in heaven. But then I knew that was not the right thing to do. And I want to say that not one of the best faith-based leaders, because I had several because of the kind of engagements I'd had with several of them in the past. Out of all those, only one told me, I cannot tell you to stay when your life is in danger. And so one faith-based leader listened to me, heard me out of so many. So it's a paradox that many said, no, stay, don't leave. But out of them, one helped me, saved my life. And now I am in the process of reclaiming my life, my health again.
If I could say thank you just so much, Anne, for sharing your story. And I think it takes a lot of courage to share publicly. And I really appreciate you bringing in your experiences. And it just really, to me, and I'd love to hear what others have to say, but just really just speaks to how important it is that we educate clergy, so that because you shared, there were so many examples of things you were told that were really causing further harm. But I also just really want to commend your internal compass that knew that they were incorrect, and that the courage that it took and the bravery to be able to hear what these people in positions of power were saying, and to know that they were wrong, and to persevere. It's hard even when we're not receiving those messages from people. So just really thank you so much for sharing. And I'm really glad to hear that you were able to safely get out, and just wish you the best on this healing journey that you're in here.
I'll just share a little bit. I also just want to echo Zafira's appreciation and acknowledgement. I think we've all been in similar spaces where just thank you for your bravery and honesty and disclosing that and sharing that with us. And also, because I think that's powerful and important. And I want to know that we heard you. We're definitely glad that you're in a better place. And like Zafira said, that you had that understanding to recognize and vocalize that you knew something was wrong. And I think that's, again, the power in education, right? If we can help, and this is also why I think it's so important for a non-faith-based domestic violence advocates and preventionists to be brave and work alongside with faith-based, because where there are perpetuations of things that are wrong, right? Infringements on people's rights and safety and access, then like we have to figure out how to fix those things. But we can't deny the fact that communities are strong, right? Communities are strong. Communities stand together and work together. And so like, how can we work within and with? And I think that's really important. I also just want to share, since you were brave and shared, I hope it's okay that I'll be brave and share as well. This work is really hard. You know, this work is really hard. And when you have institutions, right, because religion and faith are such an institution, it can be really hard to counter that, right? But I want to encourage folks to lean in. So like one of my own personal, when I actually did that series in my own community, it was actually after my cousin was killed. And I was really upset at the lack of ability by her husband. And I was disheartened by the community's inability to support her, right? But my approach was not to shun my community, and which I understand was my experience, and I'm not saying that has to be everyone's experience, but for me, my approach was to lean in and open the conversation and use this experience as an opener for a conversation, because that was so visibly and clearly wrong, right? And using that as an example to open that conversation and dialogue about like, okay, well, we know this is wrong, so what can we do about it, right? And I think it requires a lot of bravery and honesty. So again, I want to commend you for that and tell you that I hear you and I see you and I acknowledge you, and that also it's grueling work, so we can't do it alone. We need each other. There's going to be ups and downs. There's going to be times where you have that strength that I did to open the conversation, and there's going to be times where you're like, I don't, and you have to know when to take that space for yourself, right? I don't have the patience for this patriarchy today, right? And taking that space and finding your own, like the beautiful quote that Zafira shared, right? Is you have to take care of yourself kind of first before you can be a strong advocate for community.
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead, Anne, please.
Just saying thank you.
Thank you so much for your bravery, Anne, as well as you, Saara, and of course, Vera, for your thoughts too. We do have a question in the chat now. Do you have more tips or advice for approaching faith-based leaders to collaborate with them?
Oh, that's such a great question. Thank you, Melanie, for asking. I can start, and then I'd love to hear, Saara, what you have thoughts on this. But what I want to say is there's not one right way. So that's just, that's one of the first things I want to say. And that if you try one thing and it doesn't work, try again is one of the things I want to say. Because if we had just given up in the beginning, then where would Shalom be at this point? Because people really were closing the doors on us. So I think one of the most effective ways to approach this is getting to know the individual, where they're coming from, what are the values of the organization that they're in. So I think one of the things that's really helped us is to, when we're talking to rabbis, to talk about the values of their synagogue. So and to talk about the values, and then how working with survivors and talking about domestic violence supports those values. And then giving, different people do better with different kinds of approaches. So some people do really well with personal stories. So if you have stories from your community that you can share, that can be really helpful. Some people do much better with data. So there is a lot of data and statistics about this issue and how it's impacting people. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence about how, so one of the ways that we approach it is really early on in our work, we created something called the Sermon Outreach Campaign, where we work with our rabbis to give a sermon, or like it's called a Devar Torah, which is like words of Torah in Judaism, but it's usually happens during Shabbat, during our weekly Sabbath service, where a rabbi speaks from the pulpit in front of their whole congregation. And so we encourage them to speak about domestic violence during a sermon. And we have a lot of evidence from rabbis and from our organization about, after those rabbis speak, women then come for services. So women, and the first rabbi who ever did this, it was a woman rabbi in San Francisco. And after speaking for the first time about domestic violence in front of her congregation, she thought nobody in her community actually was experiencing domestic violence, but she still went and did the thing. And then I think she had like 8 women in the next 2 weeks who came to talk to her privately about abuse. So I think sharing those stories, and then again, using statistics and talking about, how we, and also one of the things I like to do is like thinking about how these people are, there's a lot of responsibility that's given to clergy and spiritual leaders. So I like to acknowledge that in my conversations with them too, and sort of just say that in a sense, you're being asked to be, a counselor, a marriage counselor, and a spiritual leader, and and like all of a teacher and all these things, and you can't be expected to be the expert on all the things. So one of the ways that we can support you is that we are coming in with expertise on this topic, but you're the expert for your community. So let's work together with our expertise to better support the needs of your community.
Thank you.
I'll echo some of that and say that, yeah, you want to just be clear in your approach about what you see that community is doing, what you know about that community, and then what you're going to be offering, right? Just be very open, upfront, clear about it. Like, we're a DV services organization, we're a prevention organization. We want to share some of these materials for you if you'd be open to that. Just like being really upfront and clear and direct about it, I think. And I think I was going to say something else, but I forgot. I got distracted with this other question about, do you encounter survivors who are rejecting their previously held beliefs as a result of their trauma? And if so, how do you support them? But just listen. You just listen. And if that is their experience, then you honor and respect that. I think there's no right answer for any, there's no cookie cutter answer for what any survivor needs. And you're always gonna I think the biggest thing with that is just respecting and empowering the survivor in their own experience. Because whether they want to disavow or use their faith or whatever it is, I think we need to honor survivors and their own experiences.
Yeah, I love that response. And I think the only thing I would add to that is, actually, it's really what you said, but just to add on this idea of listening and hearing, because some people might want to, in their healing process, figure out how to come back to their connection to religion, but some people might not. So I think listening, really hearing where that person wants to go, because one of the ways that we've supported survivors in that exact situation that you're talking about is like empowering them to think about how they can actually take back sort of control of their relationship to their religion or their spirituality. We have support groups. One of our groups is led by a rabbi. And so, giving them that opportunity if they want, but of course, never pushing anybody to. So again, like Saara said, really validating and honoring where they're at in their process, just giving them the option so that they know that if they did want to at some point reconnect to their religious beliefs, that's an option for them, but it's in no way necessary for them to move forward and heal.
Thank you both. I also want to highlight that Callum put in the chat. I keep thinking about the parable of the Good Samaritan. I hope we as community, faith-based or non-faith-based, can be Good Samaritans, can be like the Good Samaritan, excuse me. So I love that folks are now bringing in other important teachings to them in readings.
Yeah, that reminded me of a text that we use a lot in our teachings. That's from the Torah or the Old Testament. So that's, thou shalt not stand idly by the blood of thy neighbor. I'll put it in the chat. I'd have to look up. I think it's Leviticus 19:16 or something like that. And just like how we can think about, because that's what I thought of when I thought of the Good Samaritan. I just put it just to you, Kimmy. Oops.
Sorry, I can copy and paste it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I believe that's from Leviticus in the Old Testament.
There we go.
It also makes me think about, I believe it's the parable of who's your neighbor. and how everybody is our neighbor and helping each other. I think sometimes we get in that thought, well, I know this is going on, but it's not in my household, so and it's still so related within that Good Samaritan thing. It's like you're just gonna pass by and ignore what's going on because taking that initiative to really get involved, or you feel that it's out of your scope. So like where you would have people in faith-based organizations that it might be overwhelming because they just don't, there's no training to really, they haven't been trained on that, so they really don't know how to approach it. And so sometimes that person that's reaching out might feel like, where's my Good Samaritan? And I'm hoping that I would find that in my faith base, because it's when everything, no matter what it is that's going on in your life, sometimes you get to that point and the one person you call out is to who your faith is, who your belief is in. And that's, that's your neighbor at that point.
Thanks. Thanks, Callum. You also reminded me actually what I was going to say about the previous question, which was, like sometimes we can get turned off with this idea of, at least, okay, I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I'll get turned off with this idea of transactional interactions with communities or people. And I think I've learned to reframe that for myself as like a trade-based system, right? So it's like, because transactional feels very like capitalist, but trading feels like coming back to a lot of our indigenous roots and community roots, and really understanding that I have a strength and you have a different strength, and like, how can we learn from each other and both be better, right? And so I think that approach with like kind of approaching, and again, like one of the suggestions that I had shared earlier was like trying to do that positive spin on it, right? Again, which can maybe at the surface feel like you're lying or deceiving the community about what you're doing. But I think it's really about, and that's why I love prevention so much, right? Because it's not just focused on the problems, it's focused on the future and like the vision of the future. And there's hope in that. And there's like desire in that. And there's like wants for safety and betterment, improvement, and all this stuff, which is a lot more easier to sell, right? So.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, and something that that I thought of too while you were sharing was that is a core teaching too in Judaism around the value of seeing people, everyone as our neighbor, and what that means, and thinking about, I think, education. There's so many different ways that we can educate the people in our faith-based communities about the importance of supporting survivors. And one thought that I had from the Jewish perspective is, in Judaism, there are 613 commandments. So that's a lot. But one of the things that we like to point out is that the number one commandment that supersedes all of the other commandments is pikuach nefesh, and I put it in the chat, it's Hebrew, and that means to save a life or to protect a life, that supersedes all other commandments. So if like, for example, you want to, anyways, I don't want to go into all the details, but the reason I'm sharing that is because that's one of the ways that we engage people in our faith community to think about, because sometimes people worry about, oh, well, but if I talk about what's happening with my neighbor, is that me gossiping? And then there's a prohibition in the Jewish faith about, it's called lashon hara, which means evil tongue. So if I talk about my neighbor and I'm worried what's happening to them, is that potentially violating that commandment? But you're actually told and encouraged in the Torah to violate any commandment if it means that what you're actually doing is pikuach nefesh. So if by you speaking up is potentially saving a person's life, that is more important than all of the other commandments that we have.
Oh, one thing I wanted to add real quick as well is that there's a lot of hatred towards a lot of faith-based communities. There's anti-Semitism, there's Islamophobia, there's a lot of just misconceptions and misunderstandings with a lot of faith-based communities. And so I think if you're not a member of that community approaching these communities, I think that's a really important aspect to remember, because there's reasons why there might be distrust or discomfort in folks trusting other folks to, you know, come into their safe spaces, their faith-based spaces. And so I think remember just having understanding and remembering that if you're not from those communities and approaching that.
I really appreciate that thought. I really appreciate all these thoughts, actually. But, you know, reminding kind of where we are currently in the world is also important for this as well. We have about 9 minutes left. I do have a few announcements for the end, but does anyone have any final questions? We can, I know Saara put their website in the chat that has their email and that sort of thing for if anyone wants follow-up. I'm going to put mine in as well, but does anyone have anything else that they want to ask our presenters now? And if Saara, if you don't mind sharing a contact, that'd be great too, but if not, that's fine as well. I'll ask something final then. I guess what is one last thought you want to leave folks with today or hope that they take away from today? I know it's a big question.
Well, I think one of the thoughts, there's a lot of thoughts I could leave. So the one that I'll leave you with is, and I'll write this and put it in the text too for people who are visual. It's a Jewish teaching that I use sometimes in my workshops, which is, you are not expected to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. And just really wanting to remind folks that, like, as Saara said, this work is not easy on many levels. And especially in the faith-based work, it can be really challenging. So just to remember that because one person closed a door does not mean that it's, you know, that we can't open another door. And so to continue this work, and also to remember that we're not in it alone. I know that it can sometimes feel a little isolating when we're doing our work in smaller communities. And that's why I love this partnership to remind us that even like Saara and I, when we met, it's like we were talking about how we're working in different communities, but there are so many similarities of the issues and the challenges and the successes. So just remembering that we are all in this together, even if we're working within different insular communities.
I guess mine would just be mustering up the bravery and courage to have these conversations and open the dialogue and broach the subject. And again, like, prevention is possible, and trying to, you know, keep that in mind and keep the like hopefulness and the visioning and the dreaming about the type of future that we want for ourselves and our community. I think if we keep that in our forefront, which I think a lot of us already do, especially if we're in this field, it's hard not to hang on to that hope, because there is a lot of it's just hard to face the realities of the violence that does exist in our communities as it is now. That's all.
Thank you both so much. Really appreciate this conversation today and hearing about your unique perspectives and with the work that you've done. Really appreciate the folks that have shared either in the chat or by coming off mute. Of course, thank you as always to both our ASL interpreters and to our Spanish interpreters for being with us today. Before we end, just pretty perfect timing, we just have a couple minutes. Just want to mention a few final partnership announcements. This recording, as well as the links that both Saara and Saara put in the chat, so the Peaceful Families and for Shalom Bayit, will be in our resource library, hopefully tomorrow. If not, then early next week. Depends on the workload. the other things I wanted to mention is we have in the prevention team a couple of events coming up. So one is we are doing our prevention peer network call. It'll be next Friday from 2 to 3. I'm going to put it in the chat, and there it's going to be on youth in detention. Hold on, something happened with my controls. Not sure what that was, but okay. Thank you for bearing with me. The Zoom got a little weird for a moment. So I'm going to put that information in the chat. That will be happening. We also have our Building Change Together prevention training. It's a 3-day skills-based training. It'll be hybrid, so you have the option to attend either virtually or you have the option to attend us in person in Anaheim. That will be March 14th through 16th, and I'm going to put that information of how to register for that in the chat. The deadline to register for that one is going to be at the end of the month, February 28th and February 21st, if you want to be a part of the room block, if you are going to be joining us for the in-person component. We will have full PPE for that training, so masks and tests for folks that if that's a consideration. We are also going to be offering both tracks 1 and 2. So if you've taken track 1 before, you can come for track 2, or you can attend us for the first time with track 1. Any questions about anything I just mentioned, or any final questions for our wonderful presenters? Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I can give you back 3 minutes of your time. This was a really fantastic webinar, and so thank you again to Saara, Safira, our ASL interpreters, our Spanish interpreters, to folks who shared, and everyone for being here today.
Thank you for hosting.
Thanks, Saara.
Thank you, Saara. I learned a lot. I appreciate everyone being here.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.